Many people have asked, where is the bright side of Chernobyl? Even the Questioning Doggo herself has asked. Well, today we answer that question and look away from the dark and crazy political side of Chernobyl, instead to some of the more bizarre and unusual events linked to the disaster. I would like to clarify, this lightness is virtually non-existent. All of these stories are still dark in their own ways. But equally, the same people involved have commented on the humour they found in the events that unfolded, and it is this channel's duty to bring those stories to you. So, let's explore. Vasily Kizima was a tough boss. Head of the construction of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, he could see that time was running out. Ukraine had an abundance of fossil fuels, but they had now passed their peak, and the industrial region would need power. They had to accelerate the Ukrainian nuclear program, something Kizima was desperate to lead. Chernobyl saw a great leap forward in nuclear power development, accelerating quickly ahead of its sisters. Kursk nuclear power plant began construction in June of 1972, and Chernobyl in August of the same year. Meanwhile, Smolensk began construction in October of 1975, 3 years later. Flash forward to the beginning of 1984, and Chernobyl had 4 units operational, whereas Kursk had only just finished building 3, and Smolensk had just 1 reactor. Chernobyl seemed unstoppable. And then Kizima went to Moscow and requested that they accelerate the construction of Units 5 and 6, pulling their construction deadlines back a year, with Unit 5 now scheduled for completion in 1986. To do this, Kizima took risks. There is an article from around 1984 which discusses how Kizima had to choose between 2 construction workers to lead a project. One with 3 reprimands and a commendation, and another with a blank slate. Kizima chose the one with reprimands, seeing him as being more willing to take risks. Anyway, construction on Unit 5 was not proceeding well, with poor construction quality and many delays. Regardless, Kizima did not see how Bryukhanov fit into this model of risk-taking, instead seeing him as weak and soft, kind of like a marshmallow. And this is the exact word Kizima used to describe the director of the nuclear power plant he was building. And Kizima was eager to prove this to the people who arrived at Chernobyl on April 26, 1986. When the second phase of the government commission arrived, Kizima actually took a car out to meet them, and escorted 2 members of the government commission to survey the damage to Unit 4 in person. Those being Gennady Shasharin, Deputy Minister of Energy and Electrification, and Vladimir Marin, the Deputy Head of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. So, Kizima brought them out to see the damage for themselves, and so they stood, while Shasharin began choking and retching from the fumes, looking at the debris pile in front of them, seeing the emergency core cooling system tanks spilled out onto the ground, and decided the people who were going to be punished the most were themselves. Meanwhile, Kizima is walking around calling Bryukhanov a marshmallow. In a rage, Marin began kicking a chunk of graphite around like it was a football. Let's just pause here and consider. 3 people are walking around the remains of Unit 4. One of them unable to breathe and almost choking to death. One of them calling their boss a marshmallow, and one of them is basically playing football with a chunk of radioactive graphite. Meanwhile, behind them, the plant photographer, Anatoly Razgazov, has carjacked a fire engine with Boris Prushinsky and Konstantin Polushkin, members of the first phase of the government commission. Together, they are photographing the damage in the only working vehicle they could find, and Razgazov will burn out his camera film by photographing a block of graphite. What a scene. Viktor Smagin, may he rest in peace, was a good man. He did a lot on the morning of April 26, 1986, and he paid the price for it. But even in such a dark moment in history, he found humour in it all. When Smagin woke up that morning, he was unaware of the catastrophe until he was visited by his neighbour while eating breakfast, who warned him to close all the windows to his apartment because there was nuclear fuel in the air. Now, Smagin was a shift supervisor, and was aware that one of the experiments supposed to take place on April 26th was the air cooling experiment, where the water flow to the reactor was to be reduced, and air pumped through the graphite stack to cool it down instead. So, Smagin went to his balcony, where he could see straight across to Unit 4, and came to his own conclusion that during the air cooling experiment, an accumulation of steam in the steam separators had caused them to explode. And so, on the balcony, Smagin thought to himself, a fine bit of cooling that was. Anyway, Smagin got on the bus at 7 AM, and made his way to the nuclear power plant. After speaking to some people in the main administration building, he changed in the conference hall, and made his way to the scene of the accident. Smagin arrived in the control room around 7:40, and found a few men in the control room, including Mikhail Alexeyevich Lyutov, the deputy chief engineer for science. As soon as Smagin arrived, Lyutov approached him. "Smagin, give me a hand. I'm trying to find out the temperature of the graphite." Smagin, however, already saw the obvious problem with this. How can you find out the temperature of the graphite if the power's been cut off by the accident? If there's no power to the thermocouples, how can you find out the graphite temperature? And he left Lyutov sat there, pondering away. A few minutes later, the people who had been trying to open the valves came down from room 714-2, and you may recognise some of these people. Akimov and Toptonov, who both received the fatal dose in that room, as well as Alexander Nechayev, who would suffer a very severe dose, and eventually lose both his legs. He died in 2017. With them was Uskov and Orlov, both still alive, with the former man's sketches offering an insight into just what happened in that room. Anyway, they explained their plan to the fresh arrivals in the control room, and then Akimov, Toptonov, and Nechayev were escorted from the room to the infirmary. Smagin, as well as Breus, Uskov, and Orlov, would then go up to that room and continue to open the valves, allowing for water from the deaerators to possibly be pumped into the now empty reactor core. On the way back down, they looked out of the smashed windows down onto the ground immediately west of Unit 4. Down there, all they could see was debris, some of which looked like fuel, but Alexei Breus would spot water running down the side of the building, which indicated that the fire extinguishing system was still active and probably needed to be shut down. So, Smagin and Vyacheslav Orlov took the key to the reserve control room, where they could look across to the western face of Unit 4, and try to shut down that fire system. They would also need to contact Unit 3 to agree to this, but if the water continued pouring out, they would lose water pressure for the fire extinguishing system across both reactor buildings. While Smagin was obviously focused on the water, Orlov looked down at the ground outside and pointed to it. He'd seen graphite. Well, they both thought, this meant that all their attempts to cool the reactor had been pointless. And after that thought, they realised this meant that the disaster was incredibly serious. Smagin, in a state of shock, at once returned to the control room, and found Lyutov, still sat there pondering the status of the core. It was at this point that Smagin initiated perhaps the funniest conversation of the entire Chernobyl disaster. "Mikhail Alexeyevich, you were asking me about the temperature of the graphite. Now I can tell you exactly." "What is it?" Lyutov asked, and Smagin replied, "The temperature they gave out on the weather forecast this morning." "What do you mean?" Lyutov asked. "Just what I said, the air temperature. The graphite is laying outside." "It can't be!" Lyutov exclaimed. And so Smagin brought Lyutov to the reserve control room and pointed out of the window at a graphite block. But still, Lyutov would not believe him. "It is probably a reject rod assembly," he said. Vyacheslav Orlov lost his cool and swore at Lyutov. "You can see there's a male connector on it. When did you ever see a rod with a male connector?" But still Lyutov did not believe it, and they returned to the control room. Smagin, Uskov, Orlov and Lyutov were not the only ones who saw graphite, as Bagdasarov also saw blocks outside Unit 3. And the first photographer on the scene, Anatoly Raskazov, ruined an entire film of camera by photographing a piece, as mentioned in the last section. Before the destruction of the reactor was confirmed, Brekhanov and others scrambled to identify where it had come from. Their hypothesis was bizarre, to say the least. Apparently, they thought it came from west of Unit 4, on the industrial site. Here, equipment and other work for Units 5 and 6 was assembled, and then transported across by rail for installation. One of the things being assembled there was the graphite stack for Unit 5, although I'm not quite sure still how they planned on transporting it. Just look how big it is next to a human, or stick figure in this case. Anyway, they sent people to check on it, and lo and behold, there's no missing graphite blocks. So, they didn't come from there. Also, this graphite was extremely radioactive. There really shouldn't have been many explanations for it, but then again they didn't see it until dawn, which probably slowed all of their analysis down. Back to the story. Smagin would take over the shift after the current shift supervisor, Babichev, was called to the bunker in the main administration building. Later, a dosimetrist ran past shouting out the radiation level, and when Smagin saw it was going off the scale, 3.6 roentgens per hour, he evacuated the control room except for himself. Sometime later, feeling the effects of radiation exposure, he dragged himself out of the control room and was replaced by Breus while he was sent to hospital for treatment. He was sent to Moscow on April 27th by air, where he stayed in Hospital 6 with Dyatlov, Chuganov and Arkady Uskov. He was told he received a dose of 2.7 Gray, and while he did recover from the radiation sickness, he spent much of his life battling cancer, and died in October 2023. May he rest in peace. Alexei Breus is still alive. Mikhail Lyutov passed away in 2000. Serafim Vorobyov, chief of the civil defense staff of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, woke up to find out there had been an accident only a few minutes after the explosion occurred, and flagged down a colleague at 1:50 AM to drive down to the nuclear power plant and see what was happening. When they arrived, having seen the damage, they made their way to Brekhanov's office, where he had just got off a phone call, where he was essentially told not to evacuate Pripyat under any circumstances. Vorobyov decided to take a DP5 dosimeter and examine the radiation situation, having realised nobody else had done so. So he went outside the main administration building and turned it on. 150 milliroentgen per hour. Well, that's not good. So he went back downstairs to tell Brekhanov, but Brekhanov told him to stop and let him think about what to do. Vorobyov accepted this, and went back upstairs, bringing 2 of the civil defense staff with him, and got in a car to drive around the site. The numbers were staggering. First 20 roentgens per hour, then climbing to 30 and 40. And then they drove in front of Unit 4, and the number climbed far beyond 100 roentgens, up to 200, and then off the scale. Vorobyov stared in silence. He looked out the window and saw black dust, which he guessed was graphite that had been pulverized and rained down from the reactor, and then ordered the car to turn around and head back to the bunker. Vorobyov burst into the room, having sprinted from the car, and announced to everyone what he had seen. In accordance with the civil defense plans, it is necessary to announce to the population that there is a radiation accident, that protective measures must be taken. Close the windows, do not go outside. But Brekhanov ignored him. Where is the Radiation Safety Service? Where is Korobeinikov? Where is Kaplon? So, instead of heeding Vorobyov's warnings, they instead looked for Korobeinikov. And when Korobeinikov did arrive, he gave astounding numbers. 13 microrentgens per second. How these numbers were ever recorded, I am still uncertain. But as far as I am aware, Korobeinikov never commented. Vorobyov attempted to again show his measurements outside Unit 4, but Korobeinikov denied it, and Brekhanov trusted Korobeinikov as a member of the Radiation Safety Department. So, Vorobyov thought, he would have to go out again. This time, after confirming more than 200 rontgens per hour outside of Unit 4, he went north to Pripyat. Here, radiation levels were 200 millirontgens per hour, or about 6 months of background exposure every hour. And on clothes, particles were sticking, exposing a police officer on the railway bridge to 5 rontgens per hour, as well as some civilians to a similar dose. They continued driving to Pripyat, where the number remained stuck at 300 millirontgens per hour, and they concluded that the car was now too contaminated for any accurate measurements. They returned to the bunker with more values, but again Brekhanov dismissed him, trusting the official Korobeinikov over Vorobyov. At the suggestion of others who had seen the true values, he tried the party secretary Parashin, but he told Vorobyov to go talk to Brekhanov. So Vorobyov decided to call the other civil defense bodies, the ones in Kiev and Gomel. When Vorobyov picked up the phone, he tried to call Kiev, but there was no response. When he called the operator, he found out that Brekhanov had ordered that Vorobyov be refused any long-distance calls. But there was a second line, one directly to the regional defense headquarters. When he called, he expected this line to have also been cut, but by a miracle, it wasn't. Unfortunately for Vorobyov, the Chief of Staff was completely unaware of any of the significant events unfolding at the station, simply knowing there was an accident, and was convinced Vorobyov was trying to lead them into an exercise, or even just joking with the regional defense. Around 8 AM, the regional civil defense arrived, alongside Vladimir Malamush, second secretary of the Kiev Communist Party. When they arrived, Brekhanov ordered Vorobyov not to give anyone any information, which Vorobyov promptly ignored and told the civil defense the high radiation numbers. The civil defense told Malamush, and he told them to collect new measurements. And so the civil defense went back to Vorobyov and told him, Malamush ordered that there be no panic. We are to conduct radiation reconnaissance in a covert way. This is Malamush's orders. In a covert way, so that no one sees that we are walking around with devices. And Vorobyov was left perplexed. Look at how big a dosimeter is. How on earth could they hide them? Eventually, Vorobyov was called into the meeting, and for another time he reported the dangerously high radiation levels, which finally nobody disputed. However, when the evacuation of Pripyat was brought up, he said that the public needed to be warned, which Malamush refused for fear of panic. Later in the day, Nikolai Karpan, the deputy chief engineer of the Nuclear Safety Department, took Vorobyov's dosimeter and used it to measure the radiation in the turbine hall, which was also off the scale, above 250 rontgens per hour. Vorobyov was also there in the evening meeting, with Brekhanov, Shasharyan, Mariin and some others, before the arrival of Shabina and Legasov. At this point, Brekhanov had conceded that the reactor was destroyed, but when Vorobyov brought up the high radiation levels, he was again silenced. There would be no evacuation of Pripyat if the initial government commission got their way, especially in the opinion of the health bodies, surprisingly. By the time Shabina arrived, Vorobyov finally got the chance to be heard out by someone who would listen. And in the end, it was Vorobyov's numbers, as well as the work of others, that helped support the evacuation of Pripyat in spite of the refusal by doctors who were drafted into the commission. And so ended Vorobyov's bad day. If you thought Vorobyov had a bad day, get ready to hear how unfortunate Armen Abagyan's Fortnight was. If you've never heard the name, you've certainly heard of the organisation he headed if you've watched my videos before. He was the director of VNIIAES, the All-Union Research Institute for Nuclear Energy, an institution that will correctly identify the causes of the accident in 1986, and produce some very interesting papers based on the data they found. Abagyan's name also appears on INSAG 7, as one of the two commissions in the USSR that worked to disprove INSAG 1, although he is also seen as one of the key scientists behind the Vienna report. Anyway, when he's woken up in the early hours of April 26th, he's obviously rushed to where the gathered scientists and other experts were, at the Soyuz Atomenergo headquarters on Chinese Alley. Real name. The meeting room was filled with people who will become key to the story of the liquidation, from Evgeny Ignatenko to Anatoly Mayorets. Gradually, the semblance of what would become the government commission formed in that room, and with every passing hour, it began to escalate in scale. Initially, chief engineer of Soyuz Atomenergo, Boris Prushinsky, is declared the head of the commission, and then soon it was the chief of Soyuz Atomenergo, Gennady Veretennikov, and then it was Deputy Minister for Nuclear Energy Shisharin, who was on holiday in Crimea, and then it was his superior, the Minister for Nuclear Energy himself, Anatoly Mayorets, and a few hours later it was Boris Shabina, the Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministers. Abagyan was selected to be on the first group that went to Chernobyl, with Prushinsky and Ignatenko and a few others. Early in the morning, they left to get on a plane and fly to Kiev, where they then drove up to the remains of Unit 4. Later in the day, they decided to walk through Unit 4 itself, and had to run due to the high radioactivity. At this point, the graphite outside was plainly visible, and while running down corridors to check on things, they all began to wonder if it was possibly from the core of the reactor. But some of them also seemed to think it was just spare graphite blocks kept in the reactor hall for some reason. A reason not really identified. Anyway, they wouldn't get a real clear picture of the situation until Prushinsky and Polushkin returned with the photos and videos from the helicopter flight with Ratskazov. By this time, Legasov and Shabina had arrived, and they requested more reconnaissance and research. During this, Abagyan was placed on possibly the worst job out of everyone. He was ordered to lead a group to approach the destroyed reactor from the south to identify where water could be collected to spray into the reactor hall to extinguish the fire. The firefighters were convinced of their plan to pump water from the cooling pond into the reactor hall, flooding it and dousing the flames. So, they are approaching the reactor from the south, when they heard rumbles from inside the destroyed building. Suddenly, sparks erupt out of the reactor building, and the dosimeters the group have fly off the scale. What they saw is still debated, but the fear among the group is not. Abagyan ordered everyone to run and hide under a nearby bridge that went over the cooling pond canal. In doing so, Abagyan almost slipped and fell in. When radiation levels returned to normal, the group ran away and took vehicles back to Pripyat. They weren't going to fall victim to that again. That evening he called Moscow and requested urgent support, sending as many colleagues from VNIIAES as possible. Around April 27th or 28th, Abagyan got a good look at the reactor printouts from the disaster, and quickly realised how bizarre it was that reactor power surged only after AZ5 was pressed. How could that be? He wondered. According to Abagyan himself, he was never aware of the positive scram effect, and would not be made aware of this fact for many more months. So, Abagyan became more or less stuck in this loop of hell. Primarily, he focused on radiation reconnaissance, examining the radiation levels around the site. Still, he pondered what had happened to cause the power surge, and became sidelined. When Meshkov presented the Government Commission's first version of events, detailing how a loss of coolant entering the reactor led to a power surge due to the positive void coefficient, Abagyan did not sign it, arguing on the haste of the creation of the report. He would commission his own organisation, VNIIAES, to create their own report later in the year, on top of the commission by Boris Prushinsky. On May 5th, it was time for Abagyan to return to Moscow with Legasov, Shabina, and the other members of the initial government commission. Unfortunately for Abagyan, he was having a call with his deputy and bringing him up to speed on the development over the past 2 weeks. And so they left him behind. He would not return to Moscow until May 10th, overexposed. Abagyan would ultimately go on to lead one of the 2 commissions exposing the real causes of the Chernobyl disaster, creating what has become known as the Post-Truth Annex 2 of INSAC 7. In November of 2005, Abagyan and his wife Lily died trying to escape a fire started in a neighbouring apartment on the 25th floor of a high-rise building in Moscow. He was 72 years old. Did you know that between April 25th and 26th, turbines were perhaps the single most annoying and then terrifying thing in an RBMK power plant? And we're not just talking about Chernobyl here. First of all, the nuisance. The turbines themselves needed to undergo experiments that would become known as the Turbine Rundown Program. I already have done a few videos detailing it, so I will keep it brief, but they were testing to see if the turbines could continue to produce enough electricity to power the main circulation pumps in the event of an off-site power loss in conjunction with a design basis accident, the worst case scenario envisioned. The reactor could have survived either a DBA or a power loss, but it was unknown if it could survive both simultaneously. This experiment was largely written out of the programs of other RBMK power plants, who saw it as obsolete. Anyway, there was another experiment that needed to be conducted. The vibration experiments. For this, the red Mercedes was brought in to measure vibrations on turbines 7 and 8, so the bearings that the turbines rested on could be adjusted. The plan was to record the vibrations on the turbines and then perform the rundown experiment. However, this was made impossible to complete, because some turbine engineers forgot to install the brackets on turbine 8. They were unable to perform any vibration measurements on that turbine. No vibration measurements, no turbine rundown. Okay, they thought, we'll just delay everything to complete the vibration measurements. And so, at 2 PM, they had attached the brackets and were getting ready to measure the vibrations on turbine 8. And we all know what happened next. South Ukraine nuclear power plant had an accident and a reactor scram. Suddenly, the 500 megawatts being produced by Turbine 8 were vital to keeping the Ukrainian electrical grid stable. The dispatcher begged Unit 4 to delay all experiments and shut down, and they had to obey. Keep in mind that at this point they still need to conduct 2 experiments on the same turbine, and they were all going to return at midnight. And now, everyone is competing to run the 2 experiments simultaneously. The vibration measurements left to conduct on Turbine 8 in fact required it to be run down for vibration measurements, which may in fact have acted as some motivation to lower the power down below 700 megawatts in the run-up to the experiment. Alternatively, there were concerns about disconnecting the turbine at 700 megawatts, and a sudden pressure increase in the steam separators, which should have been accounted for. But there were concerns nonetheless. Shortly after the power drop, Turbine 8 was actually disconnected from the reactor and ran down for vibration measurements. And then it was synchronized to the reactor again and ran down for the turbine rundown program. And we know how that ended. Turbine 7 was effectively crushed in the explosion. and many in the control room believed that the explosion had initiated from there, with Yuri Tregub being one example. Even after the accident, they continued to cause panic. The government was under the impression that the cause of the explosions came from the turbines. This is logical, given the fact that the experiment was focused on the turbines, and the initial reports also discuss particularly damage to the turbine hull. So, they sent out a ciphered message to all nuclear power plants in the USSR, warning them to check the status of their turbines, and pay particular attention to the presence of hydrogen, which, as you may know, was used as a coolant for the turbines. Therefore, if an accident were to happen involving turbines, you can imagine how terrifying that would be for the operators that were involved. And guess what? It happened multiple times that day. In the process of shutting down Turbine 4, while preparing to scram Units 1 and 2 on the night of April 26th into April 27th, the turbine spontaneously disconnected from the reactor. As it were down and quietened, the lights to the control room, which were being powered by the turbine, also shut off, plunging the control room into the darkness. One of the witnesses, Yuri Andreev, reported that in the moment he felt transported some 18 hours back in the past and into the Unit 4 control room, and experienced the fear that they also faced. Earlier in the day, an equally terrifying event occurred at the Smolensk nuclear power plant, but differed significantly. You see here, there was an electrical fire on the panel for Turbine 4 of Unit 2. Instead of immediately shutting down the turbine, which would be a great measure to take, an AZ3 signal was initiated while the Unit 3 shift supervisor called for permission to shut the turbine down. Obviously it was granted, since they had no way of controlling the turbine, and the turbine was run down. It certainly wasn't a good 48 hours for turbines. So, this is a story I've partially mentioned in brief before, but with some new details, it is worth updating. Much of this new information is cited from the book My Chernobyl by Alexander Borovoy. The elephant's foot was first shown to the public on December 8th, 1989, in the Pravda article What Are They Doing in the Sarcophagus? The story of it being found was filled with complete accidents, bizarre events, and mysteries that still endure. Let's look back at the early days of this infamous stony beast. When it was found by crawling through a tight lead gully, the elephant's foot was fanned by coolness from air making its way in, with the opposite side of the corridor heated to 40 degrees Celsius by numerous pipes running through the room, and the initial dosimetry reports indicated a reading of 8,000 roentgens per hour in that corridor, according to Borovoy. Initially, they had no idea what it was. By the dull shine, they thought they might have found the lead that had been dropped into the reactor by helicopter, which melted and cooled here. The first person to take photographs was Valentin Obodzinski. Now, as mentioned in a previous video about Obodzinski, he had already been exposed to a very high amount of radiation in an accident when he was younger, and was now supervising the Kachatavite sarcophagus workers in their photography. They needed more photographs, but at this point Obodzinski had been retired from Chernobyl, and a photographer new to the sarcophagus had been brought in. On his first day, he was taken to photograph the elephant's foot. Accompanying him was a dosimetrist. So, they go down to the elephant's foot, and the photographer requests an additional spotlight. The dosimetrist makes his way back up the gully to the changing rooms, leaving the photographer behind, and completely forgets about him, instead talking to his fellow workers in the changing rooms. And then the lights shut out. Construction workers had cut the power to the building, leaving the entire sarcophagus in darkness. Fortunately, they all had flashlights and headlamps. It's at this point that Borovoy asks the dosimetrist where the photographer is, and the dosimetrist promptly went white as a sheet. Put yourself in the photographer's shoes. The lights have shut out. You're in a place you've never seen before, with no way of knowing which way is forward, except for an unbearable heat that is ironically pushing you away from safety, and a pleasant coolness that masks an 8,000 Ronjan per hour death trap. The workers spring up and run for the elephant's foot, but stop. At the end of the corridor, the photographer is stood, confused but unharmed. He had fortunately followed after the dosimetrist, and was very angry about being left behind, but was otherwise unharmed. For abandoning his comrade, the dosimetrist was dismissed from the sarcophagus. But the problem remained. They needed to collect a sample of the elephant's foot. The initial attempt involved a drill attached to a small RV. The RV was able to drive up to the foot, but the drill could not penetrate the outer shell. Mission failed. A soldier who was stationed with the scientists watched with disapproval. To show them the might of the Soviet army, they decided to attack the elephant's foot with an axe. The foot was undamaged. The man was also dismissed from the sarcophagus. Eventually, they were able to collect some samples, showing they had found their first corium mass, but they needed more. So they tried again, but the foot once more proved unyielding. So someone came up, quite jokingly, with the idea of shooting the elephant's foot. The workers asked the army, who sent them to the police, who sent them to the KGB, and then back to the police. The police gave them an AK-47 and ordered them to use their sniper, Captain Soroko. Soroko was in fact excellent, and shot every single target using armor-piercing rounds. From these, they collected samples and in fact shattered the top of the elephant's foot. And finally, I've mentioned this before, but everyone loves when I say this. There was a mop next to the elephant's foot. It was wedged in the corium when it was discovered. Someone removed the mop from the corium and moved it behind a pillar to the left of the foot. We still don't know who moved the mop. Anatoly Dyatlov was left broken after Chernobyl. It was his second accident, and he received a significant dose for the second time. The burns on his legs wouldn't heal, and the doctors were now refusing to send him to a sanatorium for 3 weeks after his discharge, like they were with other patients. They already knew he was under investigation, and therefore his guilt was presumed. In early November, Dyatlov was discharged from hospital, and by the 5th, he was in Kiev with his wife, and slowly he learned to walk again. Unknowingly, a KGB agent was spying on him, watching as he learned how to walk again, and always managed to cut the time it took him to walk around his apartment block all the way down to 10 minutes. And then, on December 4th, 1986, an officer arrested Dyatlov, and he was brought to jail. And at this moment, Dyatlov knew he was going to spend the next few years in prison, but was not going to go down without at least trying to take a swing back. Officially, Dyatlov was only permitted medically to partake in 2 hours of interrogation per day, but he pushed himself to his limits. 6 to 8 hours every day, reading testimony, articles, documents, everything he could to understand what happened. Side note, Dyatlov was actually charged under Article 220, Part 2 of the Criminal Code of the Ukrainian SSR. Specifically, this prohibits violation of safety regulations at an explosive facility. That's right, the Soviet government was declaring Chernobyl an explosive facility. As a second side note, what Homyuk says in HBO is true. There were in fact 26 former operators in the courtroom over those several days of the trial, but they didn't need to be convinced of anything. While the official causes of the accident had been published with a warped version of events, the measures to improve safety in RBMK reactors had also been published, and they did not match the supposed causes at all. By the trial, most scientists and operators had identified the positive scram effect as the correct cause of the disaster. Dyatlov's first attempt to bring to light the huge deficiencies in safety were by questions. The judge presiding over the case, Raymond Bryce, had declared all of the questions the defendants wished to ask to experts in the trial be pre-written. One night, Dyatlov wrote a list of 24 questions, going over how the reactor in fact failed to comply with basic safety documents, something purely design-based and nothing to do with Dyatlov. The next day, Bryce took all of these questions and dismissed them without comment. Anything that directly suggested culpability from the state was not going to be considered. It's about time we introduce Dyatlov's rival, the judge. The enigmatic Raymond Bryce. Bryce is a Latvian, but reportedly rejected by the population of Latvia for his unyielding anti-Latvian beliefs. Born in 1931 as the son of a rail engineer, Bryce would graduate from the Faculty of Law at the University of Riga and would eventually become a judge. Bryce was a very pro-Union man and exploited this to rise through the Soviet Union. Where he excelled in this was against dissidents. For example, the Baltic Federation, a made-up group of 8 supposedly anti-Soviet students who were combined into one organisation by the KGB to exaggerate the charges. The group were judged by Bryce. Despite them being accused of treason, even though some had never physically protested and merely spoke to others passingly against the Soviet Union, they were sentenced to between 5 and 15 years of prison. The sentence was so harsh that the prosecutor himself campaigned to get the sentence reduced. 10 years later, from September 20th, 1972, Bryce was on the Supreme Court of the USSR. And again, he held that position by judging the cases of dissidents and handing out the harshest sentence. Bryce did not care. He would create the version of events that best defended the Soviet Union. And as we will see, he will try to do this in the trial. But Bryce is not even the true villain of this story. He was simply there to silence the defendants and deliver a guilty verdict. So we must also consider the prosecutor, Yuri Shadrin, the senior assistant to the Prosecutor General of the USSR. Having acted as a prosecutor for 25 years, he actually outranked Bryce and held the larger office while in the town of Chernobyl. So, the prosecutors decide to collect information from all the major previous workplaces of Dyatlov. There were 2, the nuclear power plant and the Komsomolsk shipyards. Of the people who were interviewed at Chernobyl, reportedly nobody spoke up against Dyatlov. So, they tried the shipyards. Of the 8 people interviewed, none of them said anything negative about Dyatlov's character. Really not good for the prosecutor's case. It didn't matter. They would create the enemy out of Dyatlov. When the trial began, Dyatlov already knew that he would not be able to ask questions and actually present evidence to the court on his own. So when asked questions, he launched into deep monologues about his actions and their relation to the charge. If the court wouldn't listen, the scientists and operators would. Many times, Judge Bryce and Prosecutor Shadrin tried to interject and silence him, and he would get into arguments while the others were defeated. In order to control the narrative, the former operators were under constant surveillance in the courtroom by the KGB. Note-taking was forbidden, and any attempts to do so were confiscated. Meanwhile, Anatoly Dyatlov can barely speak. Apparently, he had a bad case of toothache, to the point where it felt like the entire right side of his face was being torn apart. After every court session, Dyatlov would, quote, run, end quote, back to his isolation ward for medicine, but was refused access to a dentist. And, as you may remember, Dyatlov was unable to walk much at all, so this sprint was more of a hobble. The prosecutors did a lot to control the narrative, such as witness coercion. This can be quite easily seen when comparing the testimony of witnesses. Did you know that the only testimony ever claiming that Dyatlov was in the control room during the power drop comes from the trial? Outside of it, nobody mentions him. But witnesses did defend the accused, including Dyatlov, at the trial. Let's take Gennady Deek, for example, one of the chief shift supervisors who was present on April 25th. During his testimony, he began to speak positively of Dyatlov, and Bryce paused the trial and told him to stop talking about the defendants or he would find his place of work. Not good. So Deek stopped talking. Nikolai Steinberg was asked questions by the defence about the positive scram effect. However, when he referenced that the operators could not have known about it, Prosecutor Shadrin cut him off and refused any more questions on the subject. Another tool of the prosecutors was doublespeak, of the deliberate distortion and reversal of the meaning of the words. Dyatlov was described as competent and disciplined in testimony during the trial, which Shadrin used as evidence that Dyatlov's appointment was a, quote, strategic mistake, end quote. At some point in the trial, Dyatlov actually accomplished his goal. It was brought up that the RBMK reactor failed 32 safety provisions that were required for safe reactor operation. But this did not matter, as Shadrin declared any evidence of deficiencies in safety as evidence in a case against the designers at the Kurchatov Institute and Nikiet. This led to the prosecutor taking a bizarre stance during the trial. While he was using evidence from the documents arguing that Dyatlov and the others had been negligent in running the nuclear power plant, it ignored the conclusions of said evidence that any negligence played no role in the causes of the disaster. Not that it will matter, as Dyatlov would still be found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But still, Dyatlov got the truth out. And those who were in the room throughout the trial heard it. In the end, when Dyatlov arrived in prison, he was finally able to get that dentist. After removing one of his teeth, the pain was gone, his normal speech returned, and the pain in his face disappeared. And as for Bryce, it is unknown if he is still alive today, but the last mentions indicate he is now paralysed and bedbound, unable to look after himself in any capacity. He would be 93 at the time of the making of this video. Despite Shadrin's claim that a criminal case would be brought against the designers for the safety deficiencies in the reactor design, no such case was made. Alexandrov and Dolezal remained key and celebrated players in the nuclear science space even today. As anybody who has seen HBO's miniseries knows, the official Soviet death toll, unchanged since 1987, is 31. And this is true. Look at newspapers from the time, and you can clearly see there are 31 deaths. But I have just one question. The last official death of the Chernobyl disaster is the commander of the Chernobyl MPP fire brigade at the time, Leonid Telyatnikov. He died in 2004. How was Telyatnikov counted as an official death 17 years before he died? The mystery seems to take an unusual turn the more you dig. Some books, such as Piers Paul Reads Ablaze, refer to a homeless person being found dead under the bridge of death. There is nothing really to support this in any scientific reports or whatnot. In other words, this probably isn't true. Or at least I thought this until I learned Chernobyl disaster survivor Vladimir Semikopov mentioned a homeless person who was woken by the explosion and later treated for acute radiation syndrome. There is also the supposed case of Vladislav Sliadzevsky, a victim of the Chernobyl disaster buried close to the victims at Matinsko Cemetery. Unsurprisingly, there is yet to be a photo published on the grave, not to mention that this story didn't emerge until what I've seen is 2017, on an internet forum for a stalker call of Pripyat mod. I think we can all agree that this is probably not right either. Additionally, an 80-year-old man with the initials M.Y.V. died of lung gangrene in 1987. He had second-degree acute radiation syndrome, which is the same degree as some of the official victims. Could he be the 31st death? Hard to say without research. If you do some digging on this case, a few things will appear that will clear up the mystery. In the Chernobyl Forum report from 2005, there are 31 deaths, not including Dyatlov, the 28 victims of acute radiation syndrome, Hodemchuk and Shashanok, who died on the 26th of April, and a final 31st person who died of coronary thrombosis as a result of stress, or a blood clot in the heart. However, any specific information on who they are, or when they died, has never been released. But, as it turns out, there was one little nugget of information given to us in a paper by Angelina Guskova, one of the doctors who led the treatment of the patients of Chernobyl, among many other victims of nuclear accidents. In one of these papers, she gives us a list of the deaths, including a table of the severity of radiation sickness in these patients, plus after how many days they died. Ignoring the fact that there is a number missing from the days of death on the 4th degree category, count it if you don't believe me, what this table shows is 27 people dead at Hospital 6, plus 2 in the footnotes who died as a result of the explosion. Add it up, and it makes 31. Except the second person in the footnotes is actually Klavdia Lozganova, who is also counted as one of the 27 who died. It appears that this might be the 31st death. Finally, we must discuss the closest thing to a true bright side of Chernobyl. The displacement of almost 1/3 people created an area the size of the country of Luxembourg that is largely untouched by humans, aside from the former constant flow of tour guides along the narrow path between Dytyatki checkpoint, the town of Chernobyl, and the city of Pripyat. Radiation levels in the exclusion zone today are only slightly above background in almost all places, aside from small, localized areas with hotspots, or if you dig deep enough underground. Not as deep as the Russian forces at the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War, though. That's just a myth. And from this, the flora and fauna of Chernobyl has rebounded, becoming a haven for many endangered species, from reptiles to the Przezoralski horses. Even brown bears and wolves have appeared in the zone, thriving in a diverse climate. When humans do appear, they are not there for hunting largely, but often provide food for these animals, keeping the food chain alive and stable. Or that was the case until 2022. With the disruption of the food chain brought on by the invasion, it's impossible to say what changes in ecology have actually occurred. Regardless, the Chernobyl exclusion zone and the neighbouring Polisi State Ecological Reserve are some of the best places to study life in the wild, and especially how life will continue on long after humans are gone. While the buildings of Pripyat continue to crumble and decay, fish, birds, horses, bears, wolves, foxes all continue to survive and thrive under the sun, and everything in the exclusion zone is in harmony. A harmony eclipsed by the building at the centre of it all. That's right, we still got the dark side of the moon joke. And finally, in memory of Charlie, the questioning doggo, run free on the beaches and chase those rabbits forever. I love you.